Hello. Hello and welcome. My name is Christy Potter and I'm the January series director. And it is my pleasure to welcome you today to this final day of the January series 2022. It's been a great 15 days and I'm thrilled that so many of you joined us throughout the series. We've averaged about 7,000 people a day watching and we will hit over 100,000 viewers by tonight, which is really amazing. I hope that it's a blessing to each of you. Once again, I want to thank our friends at the Doug and Maria DeVos Foundation, Baker Publishing, Meyer Foundation, all of our daily underwriters, community and creative partners, as well as individuals who sent in gifts this month for making it all possible. I also want to take time to thank my talented colleagues who are part of a cross-divisional team that makes the January series happen. There are too many of them to mention by name right now, but they really are the very best. I've had the privilege of being involved with the January series for 26 years and directing it the past 15, and I'm so thankful for that experience and for the chance to contribute to the mission of Calvin University all of these years. It's really been a joy. Thanks. So I've decided to enter a new season of life, and as we close out my final chapter of the January series story, I'm happy to say that we've already started writing new chapters. My successor will be Michael Wildscutt, and he is already at work considering great speakers for next year. I am confident the series will continue to flourish, and I can't wait to join all of you in the audience next year. And I'm excited not to have to worry about winter weather and canceled flights. Truly. Calvin University values the January series, and with the support of our faithful sponsors, it will continue to be a free gift to our growing community, both in this room, across the city, and around the world. So take good care, friends, live a good story, be kind, always keep learning, and take time to listen to one another. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's installment of the 2022 January series. My name is Jacob Opperly, and I am a senior from Grand Rapids studying literature. Would you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you're doing so, I would like to welcome all our guests from our 50 simulcast viewing locations, including Mesa, Arizona, Princeburg, Minnesota, Whitensville, Massachusetts, and Coopersville, Michigan, and to all our virtual attendees across time zones. We're grateful you're joining us today. And now, please join me for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, author of our faith, we come to you at the end of a month of communal learning, a month of discovery and wonder and hope, but also of sorrow and righteous anger. Lord, we are in awe of the beauty and diversity of your creation, and our hearts are broken in seeing the countless ways we have corrupted your gift to us. We thank you for the stories in which you have revealed yourself to us this month, and for the continuous revelation of yourself through the story of the gospel. Lord, we pray that you give us today hearts to love and to ache for you, minds to ponder deeply what we learn, and ears to listen for the ever-present whisperings of your mercy. We pray this all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. And now, Karen Saupy, English Professor Emeritus, will introduce our guest.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Saupy, and I first met Gary Schmidt a few decades ago when he conducted my preliminary interview for a job in the English department here at Calvin. The conversation went well, for me at least, so Gary and I became colleagues and friends, co-chairs for a time, and sometimes co-conspirators. Like some other fine people, he's a medievalist by training. Gary joined the Calvin faculty in 1985. When I met him a decade later, his first book was out, an academic treatise on medieval images of the mouth of hell. For some reason, that book never came out in paperback, so you may not have read it, but I doubt he'll talk much about it today. But Gary also got into teaching literature written for children and young adults, and then he got into writing it. Gary Schmidt knows how to tell a story. He's had good models like Geoffrey Chaucer and the Gawain poet, and all that early English stuff has affected his very being, and I mean that. Years ago, waking from surgery, still in that anesthesia-induced state that leads some patients to reveal the secrets of their inmost souls, Gary began to mumble. And I'm told that what came out was several lines of Beowulf, in Old English, of course. That's how deeply these old stories have soaked into his brain. So he's borrowed from the best of early English literature and from the American literary tradition he also knows so well. He uses his storytelling gifts in the classroom, in meetings, and in annual reports. He's written some fine books for younger children, some with his beloved late wife, Anne. His adaptation of Pilgrim's Progress, in my opinion, is a whole lot better than Bunyan's. But Gary's best known for a slew of young adult novels, many set in New England where he grew up. Holland, Cooper, Lizzie Bright, Cole, Joseph and Jack, Anson, Doug, Merrill Lee, Matt Coffin, and Carter Jones seem to readers as real as the kid who sat next to us on the school bus. Their stories are funny and sad and heavy and improbable and true and silly and complicated, like our lives. And so Gary's books get read, they get translated into multiple languages and read all over the world. They've earned him Newbery and Prince Honors and the Children's Choice Book Award. He writes them all on a manual typewriter, of course, inspiring more than a few English majors here to search secondhand stores for their own machines. If you have one in your attic, we can find it at home with an English major. Let's see, what else? He will sometimes work for cheesecake. My cat and his border collie will tell you that Gary has an affinity for animals. Even wild deer come to him. But unlike St. Francis of Assisi, Gary has a dark side. He's ruthlessly competitive at euchre, snowball fights, and Monopoly. I've experienced the first two, and I learned from his oldest daughter that he played 11 games of Monopoly on his honeymoon because his bride Anne won the first 10. But let's not dwell on that. Let's think instead of his granddaughter's observation that he's very good at buying lemon bars at the bakery and that he writes good books. He does indeed. So welcome, Gary.
Thanks. I am not competitive. I am, in fact, the least competitive person you know. Thank you. Thank you. Karen is amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out, folks, in this incredibly cold weather to join me on this, the last day of January Series 2020. And on this, too, the final day of Christy Potter's tenure as the guiding spirit of this amazing series. And we should begin here at the place we must begin, and that is to thank Christy, wherever she's gotten to, for years and years of gracious offerings. When we think about what a robust liberal arts college is and what such a college is meant to do to help us both gladly celebrate and keenly discern the issues of our time, we can hardly imagine a greater resource than what Christy has offered us for these 15 years. We are deeply in her debt. Please, one more time, let's say thank you to Christy for this. This is my second January series talk. The other one given, I'm actually not even sure when, 25 years ago or so, which sounds amazing. A few months ago, I dragged out my notes from that talk, which I still have, and which focused on Catherine Patterson's claim that fiction depends upon a mixture of goodness and pain, that fiction cannot exist in Eden. You need the fall to provide the brokenness that fiction is always about. And now, to be truthful, as I was reading those notes, looking at something you wrote 25 years ago is hardly ever a good idea. And there's a lot that I cringed at. But the ending was, that'll do. And I finished that talk with a reference to the Second Shepherd's Play, which is a medieval drama that concludes with the three shepherds having successfully regained their stolen ewe from a starving villain. They give mercy to the thief and then head to the stable, where they each offer a gift to the Christ child. The youngest one offers a ball, and he says to the Christ child this, "Hail, sweet is thy cheer, my heart would bleed to see thee sit here in so poor weed," that is, in such poor clothing. He's speaking to the Word, about story itself. And it says that story can offer two things, and I think this is true. It can draw us close to the cheer of God, and it can make our hearts bleed. So after some decades of writing fiction myself, what I'd like to do this afternoon is to see if I can start at where I ended 25 years ago at that point and go on from there. Starting with this, that fiction can only exist in a world that's broken, because it always addresses a world that's broken. That is its mission, its purpose, its strength, and its beauty. My own family was a collection of storytellers, though on my father's side there were a collection of very uneasy storytellers. Like many German families, their stories always began at World War II. The immigrant years before then were the years we do not speak of, mostly because of the uncomfortable relationship with Germany. I heard hardly anything about my father's childhood, or about his father's life, or about his father's life. The early stories I did hear were always kind of truncated. I remember tidbits of the story of my great-grandfather renouncing his Prussian citizenship and then skedaddling to America because he had to be outside the country's borders within 24 hours after the renunciation. I heard just the beginning of the story of my grandfather walking across the street to his parents' home in Flushing, New York in 1939, just after the invasion of Poland, and of my grandfather taking down the pictures of his father's nieces and nephews, his cousins, many wearing their Hitler Youth uniforms, and my grandfather announcing that that side of the family, and these are his words, was dead to us now. I remember my father talking about a kid on their block who answered the call to return to Germany to fight in the German army, and whose mother, now left alone by her only son, lived with drawn curtains afterwards. When he was killed, no one on the block knew how to comfort her, or even if they should, comfort the mother of a traitor. On my father's side, though, the stories of the war mattered hugely. When we drove into New York City to visit Mal and Millie, my father and Uncle Mal would quickly move past my father's bank job and Uncle Mal's job as the librarian of the New York Philharmonic and get to what counted, those days in the war, when Mal was in the Army and stationed on Guam, and my father was in the Navy and stationed on a supply ship. Here's the story that stays with me best. Mal was responsible for knowing the current positions of all ships in the Pacific Theater. The officer above him once told him that if they were suddenly overwhelmed by the enemy, the very first thing he'd do was to shoot Mal in the head. It was a joke, Mal thought, until he realized it wasn't. So one morning, Mal saw that my father's ship was coming in to supply a unit on Guam, and Mal decided that he would go meet him, as my father must have hoped too. On that day, they hadn't seen each other for well over a year. So Mal did everything he could to requisition a Jeep. And when that failed, he stole a bicycle and began to cycle across the island. He was not, and I'm being actually very kind here, he was not an athletic man. When I knew him, I could hardly even imagine him riding a bike. Nonetheless, he cycled like a madman, he said, across the island, and finally came to the port on the eastern side, arriving at the docks just in time to see my father's ship heading out to sea. He said that for the only time during the war, he stood on the dock and wept and wept. They would often tell this story with each other, back and forth, each taking their part. And when they were done, they would look at each other and they would laugh like horses. I mean, like horses. And then they'd stop, because in the end, it wasn't really a funny story. Afterwards, I always used to think of Mal standing on that dock, watching the retreating ship. I would think of my father, who was stationed on the forecastle, unsure that Mal had even known he was on the island, wishing that he had, wishing he'd seen him. I thought of Mal biking back across Guam alone and lonely, all that way for nothing. Even as a kiddo, that story was an emblem for me of what it meant to be apart, to be lonely, to be cut off by circumstances that you were not responsible for, and yet which controlled you completely. I guess it was a story that seemed, even for me as a young kiddo, to epitomize what it meant to be a mortal being. On my mother's side, things were much more writerly. My uncle's name was Bradford Ernest Smith, and though you may not know his name, perhaps some of you here will know his work. Before Sesame Street came on, there were a number of live shows. Remember when television was still live? A number of live shows that were aimed at a child audience, and one of those was Captain Kangaroo. Does anyone remember that show? Oh, yeah. My uncle wrote that show for CBS. The show extended for, no kidding folks, 6,000 performances, 29 years. It was a pastiche of cartoons and music and skits and educational bits, all featuring, of course, the captain, who wore something like a naval uniform. I never could figure it out. And he had a mustache and a bowl haircut, if you remember. And he was, and this is kind of an out-of-date word, jolly. His companions were, remember the guy who was with him? Mr. Green Jeans, that's right, who was an actor who presented himself as a kind of hayseed farmer, but who was in fact in real life a Marine. And Mr. Moose was a puppet with outsized moose antlers and who was always sort of a step or two behind the joke. And there was some sort of other animal, I never knew what it was, in costume. I think his name was Cosmo, I'm not sure, who had a large round mouth, but he never spoke. The shtick that played on most of the shows was a tremendous shower of ping pong balls that came down at a moment in crisis in some skit. And I used to wonder as a kiddo how the captain and Mr. Green Jeans would ever be able to pick up all those ping pong balls from the set and have them ready for the next show. You cannot believe, folks, you cannot believe how much cachet there was when I was in kindergarten and first and second grade with being related to the guy who wrote Captain Kangaroo. You can't believe it. It was really cool. You also can't believe that there wasn't quite so much cachet when I was in high school. But there were good years. I remember a show when Captain Kangaroo came on to tell us that one of the minor characters who appeared from time to time had passed away. That is, the actor who played that character had died. I was older then. My uncle was still writing the show. And I remember thinking how easy it would have been to have someone else play that character, minor character. How simple it would have been to just eliminate him from the show. But the captain, we always called him the captain, who was crying live television, came on to tell the children who were listening the story of this actor's life, his work with the show, how he had gotten ill, how he had died, those he left behind. The captain talked about sadness, about his sadness, but also about how that day would come when Mr. Moose would be back on and the ping pong balls would fall again. I felt, as a kid, respected. I felt that I was being told a very important story by someone who trusted me to understand why that story of that man was important, and not just another skit I was watching while I was eating my Lucky Charms. I've been asked today to talk about why stories move us, and as a writer and as a reader and as a teacher, I begin there with the stories of my own past and what they gave me, and what they still give me. Stories, good stories, provide what Aristotle called recognition. And though when he used that term, he was speaking of characters in which we see portions of ourselves, I think it's still within the framework of his thought to expand that to a recognition of the nature of the world. Stories move us in that we recognize in them what the world is like. Aristotle suggests that our response to a story should be, that's how it is. And when we respond that way, we're not just affirming the act of mimesis, of imitation. We're affirming the powerful community of reader and writer or teller who in that moment of connection are looking at the world together. Perhaps they're affirming, perhaps they're denying that this is the way that we should see the world, but nonetheless, in that moment, they are staring at the world together in perfect communion. This does not mean, of course, that we're all going to come to the same response about a story, in that as individuals we tend to see the world differently from each other. No surprise there. And I do remember how often, particularly in my teen years, again, no surprise there, I was surprised, particularly, at how different my perceptions of the Bible stories I heard told were from those perceptions of the loving teachers who instructed me in the old Quaker meeting house where Sunday school was held. They were so different. I remember arguing with Mr. Skula, who was the cool teacher who let us drive his tow truck around the neighborhood when we were 11 and 12 years old. No kidding. It was really cool. When we talked together in later years about the story of Lazarus, he could not understand how I saw it as a story about disappointment, while he saw it as a story about restoration and happiness. It seems so obvious to me in that story that everyone was disappointed. I mean, if any story tells us about the way the world is, that one does. Here's Jesus. He's just received news that his good friend Lazarus is dying. He's asked to come, and he delays and delays coming until Lazarus has died. Why delay? So he can display the power and glory of God? Pretty hard for Lazarus. And when Jesus finally does come, why is it that Martha comes to greet him and not Mary? Is he surprised at that? He would have expected Mary. And Martha's response is a killer. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mr. Skula said that was a statement of faith. I said, no, she's ticked. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus finally does get to the house, even if he might have figured that at least Mary would have understood what he was up to, she doesn't. She's ticked too. And it's obvious they've been ticked together. She says exactly the same thing to him that her sister had said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus doesn't answer. But he goes to the tomb and he stands outside, and here comes every kid's favorite verse, which is, oh guys, that was kind of pathetic. Jesus wept. Why? Mr. Skula felt it was because Lazarus had died, but I pointed out that Jesus must have known that he'd be out of the tomb in just a second. Thank you very much. Mr. Skula replied that he was crying for our mortality because we all die, and I said, you don't cry because of an abstraction. And Mr. Skula said I was a jerk kid, I should just shut up and I could forget about driving his tow truck anymore. But really, why does Jesus cry? Well, is it significant that there is no indication that Mary and Martha are with him at the tomb? Are his very closest friends disappointed in his complete failure to help? Or perhaps in using them to make a theological point? His best friends do not understand him, or his necessities, or his mission of sacrifice on our behalf, or even who he really is. How could they? In this story, Jesus seems to me so completely alone in this whole world. In a moment, there'll be the claim, of a great miracle. But is he hurt by his closest friends turning from him, by their lack of faith, by their charge of anger against him, by the loss of friendship? He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Acquainted being such a nice, polite KJV word that doesn't begin to capture what grief is all about, that doesn't begin to hint at the loneliness that it drapes around anyone who grieves like a leaden cloak. Stories move us first because they offer recognition. And in offering recognition, they insist that our humanity is communal. John Donne is right. It really is true that no one is an island unto himself. Story won't have it. Since this is a talk about story, it seems only right that I should, tell one. So I'm going to read you a story I wrote a couple of years ago for an anthology edited by a good friend who sort of knew I needed to write a story like this. Each of the writers in this anthology was asked to write a story that is a work of fiction, but it's based closely on something that really did happen to them in middle school. So with that as an introduction, sit back if you would, and let me tell you this one. You guys ready? Okay, just asking, you want to be careful here. On my first day of 8th grade at Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Junior High School, Donnie Lentz got the draft notice that told him to report to some camp down in Louisiana in 2 weeks. He would train for war for 30 days. After that, he'd be shipped to South Vietnam, where he would serve his country by joining the forces of the United States Army. Congratulations, the draft notice said. It wasn't like he hadn't expected it. He graduated from high school in June and was bagging at the A&P ever since. He said he didn't want to start college and then have to leave, like his brother had already done. I didn't know him all that well, since he was 5 years older than me and lived a couple blocks away. We went to the same church, and if we saw each other there, he'd nod or wave or something like that. And then he'd go on to his pew and sit a little apart from his parents, like he was leaving space for his missing brother. He was the only one in church who didn't carry a Bible in with him, and I think that rankled Pastor Jameson, since every so often he'd fuss about carrying your own KJV because you didn't want Jesus coming back and finding you with a crisp, brand new, spanking new Bible at home, because that meant you hadn't been reading it. And who would want to show an unread Bible to Jesus? It must have been frustrating for him to see Donnie walk in Sunday after Sunday, Bibleless. I wonder sometimes if that was why Donnie did it. I mostly knew Donnie because he ran by our house every morning when I was leaving for 3rd grade, then 4th and 5th, 6th, 7th, and now 8th grade. He had this long loping run with his head back and his mouth mostly open and his toes pointed to where he was going, his arms low and working like pistons. It looked kind of dumb. But his dog, oh my gosh, his dog made up for it. She was a border collie named Mindy, and she ran down the street like she was running the hills of Scotland, parting the high grass in front of her, searching for lost sheep, her lips pulled back and grinning, her ears back, her mouth open a little bit, running beside Donnie so easy, every so often looking up at him to be sure he was okay, which he always was. She had 2 different colored eyes, one blue, one brown. And when she pricked her ears up, the tip of the left one bent forward. Usually Donnie would just wave at me and keep on, but sometimes he'd stop, set his hands on his knees, breathe heavy, ask how I was doing, how was school going? Was I running because I looked like I'd be a good runner? Stuff like that. Mindy would sit beside him, watching him close, watching for the least sign that he was ready to go again. She wouldn't take her eyes off him even when I rubbed the back of her neck or played with her tipped ear. She wouldn't take her eyes off him even if I got down and scratched her chest. On our street, I never saw Donnie without Mindy. I think if he could have, he would have brought her to church too, which would have really gotten Pastor Jameson going. I knew Mr. Lentz, too, since he was principal of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Junior High School. I don't know what it was like for Donnie to be a student in the same school where his father was principal, since he graduated before I got there, but maybe it was easy, since everyone liked Mr. Lentz. He went to every basketball game and soccer match and football game and volleyball match and track meet, and he went to every play the Longfellow Thespians put on, and every concert the 7th grade choir, the 8th grade choir, the 9th grade women's chorale, the 9th grade men's glee club put on. He knew our names. And sometimes he'd come and sit in the cafeteria with us. Sometimes he'd even eat the food. And sometimes he'd come in and read to us, and he'd do all the voices. He was that kind of principal. The Sunday after Donnie got his draft notice, Pastor Jameson began his announcements with the news. It seemed like he and God were all excited about it. Donnie was being called to a great cause. He would be a small part in America's task of holding back communist atheism. He would bear witness to the light through the strength of his arms. Then Pastor Jameson went into an impromptu prayer. Like Joshua made Donnie Lentz defend his people, like Samson made Donnie Lentz smite the godless, like Gideon, may he lead others into battle for his Lord. I don't know how Donnie took all this in, since it was prayer after all, and Pastor Jameson was death on anyone who might look up for a glimpse, so we all kept our heads bowed and our eyes closed. But I don't think Mrs. Lentz was all that happy about the draft notice. She and Mr. Lentz laughed after the last verse of Onward Christian Soldiers, and they weren't in the church vestibule when everyone was shaking Donnie's hand and telling him he'd be fine. Wouldn't it be good to see his brother again soon? And Mr. Ingber told him the joke about remembering which was his gun and which was his rifle, and he'd better be careful with each one. And the old guys laughed, and Donnie looked embarrassed, and someone said he should remember to keep his head low, and then no one was laughing. I didn't see him and Mindy running the whole next week. I looked for them, but they never showed, until Saturday morning when they came to my house and knocked on our door. When I opened it, Donnie was standing on the porch, Mindy sitting beside him, watching him with those eyes, her ears tipped up, her ears up, the left one tipped forward. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. I told him congratulations. "Yeah," he said. I told him he must be pretty excited. I mean, going off to war? Fighting in the jungle? All that stuff? "Yeah," he said. "Killing commies," I said. He looked at me. "Ethan," he said, "another way of saying that is killing people." I told him I knew that. "A lot of people don't," he said. He reached down and played with Mindy's ears. "So," he said, "I have a favor to ask." "Yeah?" "I wonder if you take care of Mindy for me, just while I'm gone." I looked down at Mindy. She was still staring at Donnie with those eyes. "Really?" Yeah, really. She needs someone to run with her and play and stuff. My folks aren't going to do that. I thought maybe you might like to." That night at dinner, I asked my parents about Mindy. I said I'd take care of her all by myself. I said she wouldn't be any trouble. I said I'd run with her every day. I said it was like a patriotic duty. I guess my mother thought so too. She started to cry and she left the table. My father said I could take Mindy. Donnie brought her the morning he was going to leave for Louisiana. She was sitting beside him when I opened the front door. He had put a leash on her, and you could tell she didn't like it one bit. She held it in her back teeth just beneath his hand, and every so often she'd tug at it. His eyes never left him. "She's a good dog," Donnie said. "I know. And she's smart as anything. Whatever you say, she'll know what you mean." "I know. And she's really well behaved, except she'll try to get up on your bed at night. Don't let her." "Okay. She knows she shouldn't be up there, but she likes to curl up in the covers." "Okay." "Don't let her." "Okay." He played with her ears. "She loves peanut butter. Maybe give her a little every so often." "I will." "Okay." "Okay. I'll take care of her, Donnie." "Okay." He handed me the leash. And immediately, Mindy looked at me. Her ears went down. She looked at Donnie. She looked at me again. And she gave this small whine from deep inside her. He played with her ears a little bit more. Then he turned and walked down the porch stairs. Mindy pulled once to follow him, but she knew. She lay down, put her head on her front paws, and watched him walk away. That whole day, if she was outside, I had to keep her on the leash. Otherwise, she would have run back home. When she was inside the house, she lay by the front window, watching. That night, she never even tried to jump up on my bed, even when I told her she could. And I knew she was Donnie's dog. I knew it. But somehow it changed everything. Somehow when you know you have a dog waiting for you to come back home, it sort of puts junior high in perspective. I mean, a dog doesn't care if you get a first or second or third seat in band. A dog doesn't care if you can't spell efficacious. Who can? A dog doesn't care if Mr. Blue drives 60 miles an hour south while Mr. Green drives 45 miles an hour north. And how far apart are they after 20 minutes? A dog is just waiting for you to come home and run. I'm not sure Mr. Lentz cared all that much about Mr. Blue and Mr. Green either, because whenever I saw him in the halls of Longfellow Junior High, he only asked about Mindy. "She behaving?" he'd ask. "She's great," I'd say. "We appreciate what you're doing," he'd say. "Thanks," I'd say. "Tell Donnie she's fine. How's he doing?" And then Mr. Lentz would nod, give a little wave, and he'd go to wherever junior high principals have to go. For a while, Donnie wrote letters back to the church, and Pastor Jameson read them aloud during announcements. And then he would pray for Donnie, smiting the communist peril, and he would pray for protection from the enemy, and he would pray that Donnie would return to the church victorious when God's will had been done. And I would wonder if back home, Mindy was sitting by the front window watching, praying her own doggy prayers for Donnie. I even wondered who God listened to more. She never watched me like she watched Donnie. She was always looking for him. We ran every morning and she watched. We ran every afternoon after I got home from school and she watched. We ran past Donnie's house and sometimes Mr. and Mrs. Lentz would be on the porch like they were watching for us. And Mr. Lentz would give that little wave and Mindy would run up on the porch and wag her whole hind end at them and ask if Donnie was home yet. And they'd scratch her behind the ears and she'd know and come back to me to finish our run. Mindy even watched when we turned on the 6 o'clock news and we saw the pictures of the soldiers fighting in Vietnam. And I learned that Pastor Jameson did not know what the hell he was talking about. Mindy and I would sit together, and I would hold her, and I hoped we wouldn't see Donnie on the screen. Not with what was happening there. Sometimes my mother would get up suddenly, turn the news off. Sometimes my father would use words about President Johnson that I never heard him say anywhere else. Then the letters from Donnie stopped, or at least Pastor Jameson stopped reading what they said. I wasn't sure which. And so a year went by, and who knew how many hours of algebra problems and social studies essays on foreign cultures and life science lab reports and book evaluations of To Kill a Mockingbird in 1984 and The Diary of Anne Frank and Flowers for Algernon, and all done in the dining room while Mindy watched at the front window. And who knew how many hours of running with Mindy, enough so that late in the spring, when Mr. Lentz saw me run the mile in PE, he was a PE coach too, he told me I should run cross country in 9th grade, and I told him I would. At the beginning of my last year of junior high, 2 things happened. First, we stopped going to Pastor Jameson's church. My mother said she'd had one too many smites preached at her. In the middle of a sermon about Jericho, she looked at me and she almost started to cry, and then she took my hand and she said to my father, "We are leaving." And we did, right in the middle of the sermon before the walls came tumbling down. And second, Donnie Lentz came home. But it was a few weeks before we found out. I think Mindy knew before I did. After a year, she'd stopped looking out the front window. At least she didn't do it all the time. Now she sat beside me at dinner. She lay beside my bed at night. She followed me to the backyard and caught anything I threw, a frisbee, a tennis ball, a stick of wood, a biscuit. I didn't need to keep her on a leash ever. When we ran just like she and Donnie used to, side by side, with her looking up at me most of the time, and even sometimes jumping up and nipping at my butt, joking around like I was a sheep she was herding, until one Saturday when she stopped when we got to the end of Donnie's block and looked down it and sprinted to his house. She wouldn't stop, no matter what I yelled. She ran down the street, scooted across the front yard like border collies do, close to the ground, so fast. Took the 4 steps on the porch with one jump, skidded with her back legs splayed out to the front door. So I rang the doorbell. Suppose she was right. But no one answered. Then I knocked because Mindy was watching and she wanted me to. And the lights on, nothing. Even so, it took a long while before she'd come away. And after that, Mindy went back to watching out our front window. She knew. But that wasn't how I found out that Donnie was back. I found out when Pastor Jameson and Mr. Lentz knocked on our door one afternoon. I had just gotten back from school and was getting ready to run with Mindy. She was eager. She was standing up on her toes the way border collies do, ears up, left one tip forward, grinning. Perfect day. Blue October, leaves starting to tilt toward high colors. High clouds, that dry smell of autumn. I was looking for my sweatshirt in the mudroom when I heard the knock and Mindy scooted to the door. Pastor Jameson was in a full-on suit, of course. He wasn't holding his Bible like he usually was, and he looked sort of stiff, maybe because we hadn't been coming since Jericho and things felt kind of awkward. And I hadn't seen Mr. Lentz for a few days, actually when I thought of it, for a few weeks. "Hello, Ethan," he said. "She behaving?" "She's great," I said. I looked at Pastor Jameson. "Pastor, I'm sorry, but my parents aren't here." He laughed a little. "You know, I've never done this before, but we're actually here to see her." He pointed to Mindy. "You're here to see Mindy?" "Ethan, Donnie's home," said Mr. Lentz. And you know, I knew this day would come. But I suddenly felt like I was either going to throw up or cry. Of course Mindy was Donnie's dog. Like I said, I knew that. Of course he was always going to come back and she'd be his dog again. Of course. But for the past year, we'd run like we belonged together, and it didn't matter so much if during the day there were jerks who do what jerks do in junior high, or teachers who didn't like you because they were in a bad mood or because they hadn't had their morning coffee, or this girl who laughed when you asked if she might want to go out on Friday because there was this movie and you thought, but she never thought. None of that mattered so much because Mindy was always ready to run. I loved her. "I think Donnie needs his dog," Pastor Jameson said. "Ethan, at night when he's alone, the dreams he has," Mr. Lentz couldn't finish. Mindy looked up at me. She knew. "Okay," I said. I think that's what I said. Mr. Lentz looked down at me. I bet you meant the world to her this last year, he said. He reached down and rubbed her between the ears. I bet this will be hard as hell for both of you. I looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. It's okay, I said. No, Mr. Lentz said. None of this is okay. It was as hard as hell. We went for our run. It was longer than usual. We messed around when we got home. I took a long shower. I took a long time to get dressed. We played tug-of-war with my socks. I didn't try too hard to get them. I found her leash and put it on, which she wasn't happy about. She held the leash with her back teeth. Tried not to cry as we walked the 2 blocks. Then as we got closer to Donnie's house, Mindy dropped the leash and she started pulling. Then she was pulling really hard. Then we're on the front porch and she was wiggling so much I could hardly take the leash off. I rang the doorbell. No one answered. I knocked. No one. You can't believe how hard it is to get ready to give up what you love most in the world and then not have anyone take it. You can't believe it. But then the door jerked open and Donnie stood there. Mindy went crazy. She jumped, she cried, she lay on her back with all 4 feet up, she whined, she jumped again, she ran around him, she nipped his butt, she jumped again, she cried again. And Donnie never moved. He never moved. He looked at me like he didn't even know who I was. He looked at me like I was standing away on the horizon, 1,000,000 miles away. Hey, Donnie, I said. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he said, you shouldn't be here. What? But he didn't answer. At the sound of his voice, Mindy stood up on her hind legs and reached with her paws like she wanted to hug him. And with one quick move, he pulled back and smacked her on the side of her head, so hard that she yelped and scooted across the porch. Donnie, I said. Mindy crouched into herself. She put her tail low between her legs, brought her head down, crawled back, and turned her belly up to him. He kicked her square in the ribs. I knelt down over her. It's Mindy, Donnie, it's Mindy. Don't. He closed the door. I heard it lock. And Mindy crept down the porch stairs, her tail still tight beneath her. Then she turned, and she waited for me. I didn't need to put the leash on. That night, and for many, many nights afterward, Mindy slept on my bed. She slept on my bed. And when she whined in her dreams, I leaned over and I held her tightly. This is a story I do not read in public aloud often because it is for me not really a story about a dog and his boy. It's a story that's much closer to my current life, actually. But I hope, too, that there are some here who recognize the emotions that that story is trying to evoke or to capture or to recall. This is a story about coming to new understandings that may hurt and disappoint. It's a story about pains of growing up, getting older. It's a story about losing. We know these feelings. Aristotle would say we recognize them. That is how it is. And when we see them, perhaps we can allow ourselves to be moved by them. Story offers us recognition, and in recognition we are, as readers, changed and moved. At least that's what the writer hopes for. It is what fiction is for. It is what fiction is about. But there is more. Several years ago, Professor Freeberg and I brought a group of students up to Stratford, Ontario, to see several plays as part of the annual Shakespeare Festival. One of the plays is always a musical, which I confess I am not always excited about, all that sudden breaking into song in the middle of crises, come on. But we went to see Man of La Mancha. On this trip was an English major who was very interested in theater. And with her was her engineer boyfriend, who was not very interested in theater. But he was very, very interested in her. And he came along on that motivation and that motivation alone. We do this trip on a very tight budget, so the tickets were, shall we say, the cheap seats around the edges of a vast theater. And it turned out that the English major and her engineering boyfriend randomly got the tickets for this show at the very, very top of the theater. I mean, you needed a telescope. The engineering major didn't care as he settled in beside her, fully aware of his real motivation for coming and eager for the privacy. But the engineering major really did care that a moment later, I came and sat down beside the two of them because I had drawn the third ticket in the row. This was not, as you can imagine, a delightful coincidence for them, and it was actually pretty weird for me too. At the end of the play, after Don Quixote's adventures and misadventures, his family discovers him and forces him to come home. And as he lies on what is clearly his deathbed, they try to force him to give up this ridiculous identity of Don Quixote, which he has assumed, and to speak finally his real family name. What is your name, they insist. What is your real name? Speak it, they say it. And this engineering major beside me up in the seventh heaven of this vast theater, no kidding, he leans forward in his seat and he whispers, say Don Quixote. Tell him it's Don Quixote. But he doesn't. At that moment, the character yields and speaks his family name instead. And this engineering major next to me, he sits back with this terrible sigh of disappointment. I tell you the truth, at that moment, I would have done all the work I had put into that trip for him and for him alone, so that he could be pierced with story as he had been, so that he could learn what art can do. And it doesn't matter that the musical, because it's a stupid musical, ends with Don Quixote standing up and eventually reasserting his imagined identity as the Lord of La Mancha. This engineering major had already seen it, the terrible brokenness of a world without charity, without imagination, without humanity. He had seen it, and he knew it was a true seeing, and he was changed. A few weeks ago, Jacob, who was the student who opened our session with prayer today, pointed me to David Foster Wallace's book, This is Water. When Jacob told me it was short, I was sure he was mistaken, since David Foster Wallace had no idea how to write a short anything. But he was right, it is short, and it opens with this short anecdote, which perhaps some of you know. There are these two young fish, this is quoting Wallace now, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" We live, folks, we live in a culture that is powerful and controlling and dominant and insistent upon itself. And its greatest power comes from the fact that it doesn't announce itself. We hardly know it's there. We don't know we're swimming in water because it's so accepted and unquestioned. Story tells us that it's there. Story questions it. Story calls for us to pay attention. Story insists that we pay attention because story tells us what it's like to live in the culture we live in, to see its effects. In Jed Pearl's new book, Authority and Freedom, A Defense of the Arts, it's just out. He argues that the arts and that story can move us so powerfully because they have the capacity to heighten and intensify experience. And this comes about when the artist and the viewer or reader are drawn by what he calls an imaginative imperative. Or to put it this way, in Henry David Thoreau's words, the arts have the ability to wake us up, individually and collectively. And in heightening experience and in waking us up, story offers this possibility. We can respond more passionately, more wisely, more fully to the world around us because of the encounter. And this is one reason, and only one, why the loss of a vigorous support for the arts in colleges and universities across North America is so frighteningly self-destructive. When our culture insists that we consume and consume and consume, when our culture preaches not self-reliance but self-absorption and self-investment, when our culture focuses us on the banal and the trivial, when our culture suggests that a story about a TikTok personality should be given the same level of significance and attention as a report on the loss of the whole ecosystem, when the culture projects and protects a social media whose workings are, let's just say it, purposefully obscene and obviously destructive of communities, and often manipulated to no good purpose, when all that happens, story begs us to pay attention to the individual, to the communal, to every complex and striving soul in our midst who is loved by the Lord and shaped by the Lord and held in the palm of God's hand against the onslaughts of our broken world. We see this in the ways that story offers us avenues of response. And I find that when I am most moved by story, I am moved by those offered venues, particularly when the avenue that's given is one of grace. The Ethiopian writer Meron Hodero has a recent short story, The Suitcase, that tells of Saba, who has come to the city of Addis Ababa to visit her relatives. She has brought 2 suitcases with her, one filled with what she needs over the next few weeks, the other filled with gifts from her family in the United States. It's a heady visit for Saba as she opens channels between hard-to-bridge worlds, and as she begins to understand and live in the country of her own family's history. That living is exciting and rambunctious and a little bit frightening, but Saba begins to get a sense of how important her own heritage is to her. Her Ethiopian family sees this as growth and this budding love, but they haven't seen this before. A relative comes, enjoys a kind of recreational stay, goes back to America, and they never hear from her again. They're a little resigned to this happening with Saba. When it comes time to leave, Saba packs, and then she is asked to bring out the one empty suitcase so that her Ethiopian family can fill it with gifts they want to send back to the States. The problem is, there is no way that all that they want to send back with Saba will fit into this suitcase, no matter how they pack it and stuff it and negotiate the space. There's no way. So the question becomes, whose gifts will Saba take back? This, as you might expect, leads to huge fights over who gets to send their gift. And so time passes, and the time to leave for the airport is already passed, and now the tension in the air is huge. Can you guess what they do? Saba walked to the suitcase she had packed herself, filled with her own things, and in one quick gesture, she opened it, emptied the contents. Her best clothes fell to the floor, her favorite old jeans, most sophisticated dresses, her one polished blazer, a new pair of boots, T-shirts collected from concerts and trips and relationships. She passed the empty suitcase to the center of the room. "Dear friends, neighbors, and relatives," she said in forced Amharic, looking at the confused expressions that confronted her, "please, now there's room for all." There were gasps and whispers, whistles, an inexplicable loud thud. No laughter. "Are you sure?" they asked. "It's the least I can do," Saba said slowly. "What about your belongings?" Fossil asked. "We'll keep them safe for her in case she returns," Kanjit said, her voice commanding the space. "Until she returns," Rahil corrected. "Will you return?" Kanjit asked, and Saba said, "Yes." This open suitcase is Saba's affirmation of her family's love, and her affirmation that this is not over for her. She has changed. She's grown into a new heritage. How could she go back? She will be back here. This is what identification and recognition and grace look like, the story says. And then this story also says, reader, what's your response? We are moved by story because it offers us ways to respond to the world we recognize. That is what moves us. So let us end with this, a challenge for you and for all writers who live in a broken world. Go home this afternoon, and tonight, for just a few minutes, write the story of the woman in Flushing, New York in 1944 who lives behind drawn curtains. She lives alone. Her beloved son, who spent his childhood playing with the kids up and down the block, has followed what he thought was his duty, and he's gone back to fight on the German side. He is a traitor to everyone this woman knows. And though she has not gone back, no one from the block now speaks to her. No one stops and knocks at her door. No one offers to help her carry the groceries. No one invites her to sit on the stoop with them as evening comes on. On Sundays, she huddles in the back pew of St. Paul's Lutheran and leaves before the final prayer. And this morning she got the telegram she has feared all along. It has announced her son's death while fighting for his country. And though there are gold stars in some of the windows up and down the block, there will not be one in hers. Pray for that woman retroactively, since time means nothing to our Lord. And then write that story, because you love the world the Lord has made, even in all its brokenness. How does story move us? Why does story move us? That's how. And that's why. Because as Robert Bolt wrote, God made the angels to show him splendor, and he made animals for their innocence, and he made plants for their simplicity. But humanity he made to serve him wittily in the tangle of our minds. Thank you so much, folks. The Lord God bless and keep us all. Thank you.
That'll do. If you have questions, the best thing to do at this point is email them to askjseries@calvin.edu. We have time for just a few. The most urgent are about border collies and the name of your current border collie. That comes from Winnie the border collie.
Do you really want to know?
I know.
We had a border collie named Darcy for many years, and my wife used to say we should get a Bingley, because in Pride and Prejudice, Darcy and Bingley are very, very close friends, and we never did. And then we finally got. Now, just a year ago, we got a new border collie, and his name is Bingley.
Great. We could go on about why border collies are the best dog, but
we could do that for a long time because it's true.
Yes, but there are a lot of questions about your writing process. One of which is what comes first, character or plot? And I know from Carter Jones, it was just a situation that occurred to you, right?
Yeah, I mean, Carter Jones was literally just an image of a butler standing on a stoop in the rain on the first day of 6th grade, and so that opens lots of questions. I think the thing that always comes first, though, is actually the narrator. Like, what does the narrator sound like? Is it first, second, third? Usually not second, of course. But what does that voice sound like? And then I can kind of start to write. I can put the words in because I know what that voice is like. And then probably after that is character. And then you discover, well, what's the thing that you can do, the key that you put in the ignition that starts the event, that starts the story, and that's plot, but that's third. That comes down the line a little bit for me.
It's almost like the plot is the calling for the character.
Exactly. Yeah. What's the thing that's going to turn this, to activate the character?
How do you develop your characters? They feel so real, as one person says. They seem like real people. Are you sometimes thinking about real people?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Pilgrim's Progress. The character of Help there is Jim Van de Bosch.
Yes.
And if you look at that scene, you would absolutely see it's just, I hope you would see that it's Jim Van de Bosch.
Jim was our colleague in the English department and a good guy.
So sometimes it's one person. Usually it's a part, or like there's something quirky or something about an individual I can use. Faulkner said that you should take your relatives and just cut them up, which feels a little violent. It feels a little violent to me. But in fact, it's sort of an interesting way to look. I mean, if you need a character who has this quality or something, why not go to someone that you already know? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the characters are me, or at least what I hope I would have been in that situation. So Holling and Wednesday Wars is about as close to autobiography as I will ever get.
Do you find it harder to write from the perspective of a young girl? Is that harder than writing as a boy?
Yeah, and so if you follow them, you'll notice that it hardly ever happens. So Merrily, this January, or last January, a year ago, a book came out called Just Like That. And that was me sort of saying, try and be a grown-up, do something different, have a protagonist that's a female character. And so Merrily is, in fact, the first time. And that was sort of planned, though. I mean, Wednesday Wars has several characters, and each of the characters in that will get his or her own book. So right now I'm working on Danny's book.
Great. Great.
So we'll see.
And you're doing what I think Marilyn Robinson's doing is these are sort of parallel novels about the world of characters, but not sequels.
Right, they're not sequels at all.
We have a balcony full of school kids, one of whom wants to know, what do you recommend, what was your favorite book you wrote?
Well, the standard answer to favorite book you wrote question is always, and you guys will hear this all the time, the writer will say, the book I'm working on now. And in some ways that's kind of true. In some ways you do feel that. I think probably my favorite now is Orbiting Jupiter. Though it's, a lot of people hate it for various reasons. But it's the closest to me.
It's a heavy book, yeah.
It's a hard book. I mean, in that book, an 8th grader has a kiddo. And so the story is of what happens when an 8th grade kid has a kid. And a lot of folks are frustrated with that narrative moment. as if somehow that doesn't happen. I actually had one person say, well, that would never happen in my school. And I'm thinking, well, I hope not, because that person will never get support.
Do you think you'll ever write a novel with an adult protagonist?
No. Well, middle school is such an interesting time. It's the time that none of us want to go back to. Sorry, guys. But, I mean, you will hear adults say, oh, I'd love to relive college, or I'd love to relive high school. No one ever says, I'd love to relive middle school. No one ever says that. And yet, it's that time in our lives, right, when we are caught between, not caught, but we are poised between childhood and adulthood, when we're looking back at the securities of the one and we're looking forward to the freedoms and responsibilities of the other. That's a fascinating time. And for a writer, it creates enormous tension. And so you have this sense that already, as you're thinking about this story, what's the tension I'm going to build in? Well, dang, it's already there. And you just have to find the adventure to build around it.
Do you think, too, that looking back on those difficult years, creating stories helps you process what it was all about?
Oh, yeah. Not that it's trauma that I'm sitting there and dealing with, but it certainly is the case that it's easy to think back on what those years are. Easier for me than high school is, in fact, because they are hard years. They're strange years when you're trying to identify who you really are. I mean, it's the years when you finally come to the point when you say, do I believe this? All this Christian stuff. Do I believe this because I believe it? Or do I believe it because my parents believe it? And I just am expected to believe it. I mean, that's when you decide. Even political stuff. I mean, am I on the right? Am I on the left? How am I going to do that? How would I make that decision? And how do I make it authentically me? That's fascinating. And it's a really hard time, but I think it's also a vivid time. And so it's not hard for me to sit at a desk and go back to Mr. Healy's mathematics classroom or any of those times. It's rather easy to do that.
How do you make time to write with work and life and other distractions?
500 words a day. Everyone can do 500 words a day. It's a page and a half. I haven't done mine today, but I'll do them tonight. And I do it every single day. Sometimes it all gets chucked and fine. There's a wood stove. It's easy to burn it all up. But sometimes it's decent. And then you can start to add up. And I use a typewriter, so to watch a pile of pages get higher and higher, that's kind of satisfying. It kind of is nice. Also, if you use a typewriter, it has this tremendous advantage. You get to the end of the line, and it goes ding. It's sort of like saying, good job, do it again. And so you go back and you do it all over again, and it goes terrific again. And it's fantastic.
It's like the worst video game ever. Or the best.
One or the other.
A 12-year-old wants to know, in the Wednesday Wars, did you ever name Doug's brother? If so, what was his name?
Yeah, in the Wednesday Wars, names are important. You don't know his sister until Holling is able to connect with her. And you don't know Doug's brother's name until, because he never connects. There's no reason for him to actually know it. Names give us, I don't want to say power, but connectiveness. It's hard to hate someone whose name you know. It's easy to hate someone whose name you don't know. And so in that book, it really is, it's very deliberate that you don't find out. If you want to know, it's in OK for Now, where in the next novel over, and you see a scene where Doug's older brother, and there's actually two older brothers, but Doug's immediately older brother reveals his name, or the narrator actually reveals the name.
Last question. As you're writing, do you revise as you go, or do you crank out a whole lot of stuff and then go back and tinker?
Yeah, that's kind of a classic question. There are people who write who just go straight through. So Donna Jo Napoli, some of you may know, she writes her novels in 6 months. I hate her. But she goes straight through. She doesn't stop. She writes in these mega sessions for hours, and she won't go back and blah, blah, blah. And that's not me. I have too much New England blood to really do that. And so for me, I start where I have, at the beginning of a chapter that I've left, and I revise until I get to where I've stopped, and then I do my 2 pages, my 500 words. And I do that every single time so that I'm always revising as I go along. So the first pages of any given chapter will be revised 10 times before I reach the last 2 pages of that chapter. And then, of course, that's a year, and then you revise again over the next year. So a book normally takes at least 2 years. The most recent one, just like that, it came out last January, and it was accepted in 2011. That was a slow one. It varies. It just varies depending on how hard it is or what I'm trying to figure out.
Your former student and mine, Brandon Hahn, affirms that you are indeed competitive in snowball fights. Writers Retreat 2010. Thank you, Gary. Thanks once more to Christy Potter. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our underwriters today, the Center for Innovation in Business. And we will see you next year at January Series 2023.